I'm 77 years old, and I no longer answer the door unannounced. Not out of fear, and not out of bitterness toward the world, but because I have finally learned something that took me most of a lifetime to understand. Just because someone shows up does not mean they are owed my time. I have lived long enough to see how people treat an open door as an invitation to take without asking, and how a closed one, calmly and firmly kept closed, can become one of the most freeing decisions of an entire life. For most of my years, I was the person who answered every knock. I was raised to believe that hospitality was a virtue without conditions, that a good person always makes room, always welcomes, always drops whatever they are doing the moment someone appears at the threshold. I answered the door in the middle of meals. I answered it during rest, during illness, during the rare quiet afternoons I had carved out just for myself. I told myself this was kindness. I told myself this was who I was supposed to be. But somewhere along the way, I began to notice a pattern I could not ignore any longer. A pattern that revealed something uncomfortable about the people who showed up unannounced, and about myself for always making room for them without question. There are, I have come to understand, several kinds of people who arrive without warning. There are those who do it out of simple thoughtlessness, people who have never once considered that another person's day might already be full, that another person's time might already belong to something or someone else. There are those who do it out of a quiet sense of entitlement, believing that closeness with someone grants automatic access to their home at any hour, as their relationship erases the need for basic consideration. And then there are those, the ones I came to recognize most clearly with age, who show up unannounced precisely because they know that giving warning would give me the chance to say no. They preferred the element of surprise because a closed door caught off guard is far easier to open than one that had time to decide against it. I did not see this clearly until I was well into my 70s. For years I believed I was simply generous, simply open, simply the kind of person people felt comfortable dropping in on. It took a long series of small moments, a niece who arrived during my afternoon rest expecting to be entertained, a neighbor who let herself practically into my kitchen expecting coffee and conversation on a day I badly needed silence, a distant cousin who showed up with an agenda disguised as a casual visit, for me to understand that my open door had slowly become an open invitation for people to bypass my own wishes entirely. Nobody asked if it was a good time. Nobody considered that I might already be tired, or occupied, or simply craving solitude after a long life of constant availability. They simply knocked, and I simply opened, because that is what I had always done, and because I had never once given myself permission to do otherwise. There is a distinction I had to learn slowly, one that changed everything about how I spend the later years of my life. It is the difference between welcoming and yielding. Welcoming is something you choose. It happens when you decide, in advance and with full willingness, to open your home and your time to someone. Yielding is different. Yielding happens under pressure, in the moment, when someone's presence at your door creates a kind of social obligation that feels impossible to refuse without appearing rude or cold. For most of my life I mistook yielding for welcoming, believing that if I opened the door, I must have wanted to. But wanting had very little to do with it. What I was actually doing was surrendering my own plans, my own rest, my own peace, simply because refusing felt harder than complying. Once I understood that distinction, I began asking myself a question I had never asked before. Why do I believe that an unannounced visitor deserves more consideration than my own need for rest or solitude? Why had I spent decades treating spontaneous intrusion as a kind of honor rather than what it actually was, a disregard for my time dressed up as friendliness? The answer, once I sat with it honestly, was simple and a little painful. I had been taught that my time belonged to whoever asked for it loudly enough, and an unannounced knock at the door is one of the loudest requests there is, because it demands an answer immediately, without room for reflection, without room for a simple, thoughtful, honest no. So I stopped answering. Not every single time out of principle, but as a new practice, a new posture toward my own life. If someone arrives without calling first, without texting, without any warning at all, I simply do not open the door. I go on with whatever I was doing, and if it matters, they will call, and if they call, we will find a time that suits us both. The first few times I did this, I felt an old, familiar guilt rising in my chest, the same guilt that had governed my behavior for decades. But that guilt faded far faster than I expected, replaced by something I had not felt in years, a sense that my home, my afternoons, my quiet hours were finally, fully mine again. What surprised me most was how the people in my life responded. Some, the ones who genuinely cared about spending time with me rather than simply occupying my space whenever convenient for them, adjusted without complaint. They began calling ahead. They began asking if a visit would be welcome instead of assuming it always would be. Those relationships, if anything, became warmer, because now our time together was chosen by both of us rather than imposed by one. But others, the ones who had grown accustomed to my endless availability, reacted with a kind of surprise that told me everything I needed to know. Some pushed back gently, joking about how I used to always be up for a visit. Some pushed back less gently, implying I had become distant, difficult, closed off in my old age. I let those comments pass without much defense, because I had finally learned that I did not owe anyone an explanation for protecting my own peace. This brings me to something I did not expect to discover when I first began closing my door to unannounced visitors, something about how much of ourselves we give away simply because someone expects it, and whether that expectation was ever fair to begin with. Because the door was never really the issue. The issue was a lifetime of believing that my presence, my time, my energy belonged first to whoever demanded it and only afterward to myself. Once I began protecting my door, I found myself naturally protecting other things too. I stopped picking up every phone call the instant it rang, choosing instead to call back when I actually had the capacity for a real conversation. I stopped rearranging entire days around requests that arrived with no warning and no consideration for what I might already have planned. I began, for the first time in decades, treating my own schedule with the same seriousness I had always given everyone else's. I noticed something else too, something quieter but just as meaningful. The freedom I felt from an unanswered door began to change how I felt about my home itself. For years my house had felt less like a sanctuary and more like a waiting room, always ready to receive whoever might arrive, always slightly on alert for the next unexpected knock. Once I stopped answering unannounced, my home became mine again in a way I had not experienced since I was much younger. I could sit in silence without half listening for a car pulling into the driveway. I could nap in the afternoon without the low hum of anxiety that someone might interrupt it. I could simply exist in my own space without needing to perform hospitality on demand for anyone who happened to show up. There is a kind of dignity in this that I wish I had understood decades earlier. Saying no to an unannounced visitor is not coldness. It is not the withdrawal of love. It is simply the recognition that love and respect can coexist with boundaries, that the people who truly value your company will make the small effort of letting you know they are coming, and that effort itself is a form of respect I had been giving away for free for far too long. I no longer feel guilty about this. If anything, I feel a quiet pride in having finally learned, in my 77th year, something that should perhaps have been obvious from the very beginning, that my time is not a public resource simply because my door has a doorbell. I want to be clear that this has not made me isolated or lonely. If anything, the opposite has happened. Because I no longer dread the unpredictable knock, I look forward far more to the visits that are actually planned, the ones where I have had time to prepare, to rest beforehand, to genuinely be present instead of quietly resentful underneath a forced smile. My relationships have not shrunk. They have simply become more intentional, built now on mutual consideration rather than one-sided availability. And intentional relationships, I have come to learn, are far richer than the ones sustained purely by habit and unspoken obligation. If you are further along in life and recognize this same pattern in yourself, the endless answering, the guilt at the thought of not opening the door, the quiet resentment that builds after years of surrendering your time to whoever happens to show up, I want you to know that it is not too late to change it. You do not need a dramatic confrontation to reclaim your peace. You simply need to stop opening the door when it does not suit you, and let the silence on the other side speak for itself. The people who matter will understand. The people who do not will eventually stop knocking, and you will find, as I did, that the space left behind is not loneliness at all, but room, finally, to breathe. So if I could leave you with one thing from everything I have learned in these later years, it would be this. Your unanswered door is not rejection. Your need for warning before a visit is not unkindness. And your right to protect your own quiet hours is not something you need anyone else's permission to claim. I have never felt freer than I do now, at 77, sitting in a home that finally answers to me and no one else. Thank you for spending this time with me. If any part of this resonated with you, I hope you carry it forward into your own life and your own home. This has been Eternal Flame Wisdom, and until next time, protect your peace, guard your quiet hours, and take good care of yourself.